Welcome to the Hidden Library. Tonight, we unseal another forgotten volume of mystery, A Daughter's Return. In the quiet village of St. Mary Mead, winter blooms hide secrets long buried. When Miss Marple accepts an invitation to view a garden of rare snowdrops, she finds instead a story of lost identity, betrayal, and a mother's hidden past. If you enjoy mysteries in the spirit of Agatha Christie, subscribe now. Your support keeps the lamps burning in the Hidden Library. Before we begin, share in the comments where you're listening from. Your words illuminate the dark alleys of the Hidden Library. Now, settle in by the fire, let the frost press against the window, and join Miss Marple as she unravels A Daughter's Return. Chapter 1. Snowdrops in Winter. Miss Marple was attending to her winter garden when Mrs. Dolly Bantry hurried through her gate, cheeks flushed with both cold and excitement. The February wind had disarranged her hat, giving her a somewhat dishevelled appearance that spoke of haste. "Jane, I have come straight away to tell you," she announced, pausing to catch her breath. "You must come with me this afternoon to Thornwell Lodge. Mrs. Dean has invited me to view her special snowdrops, and she particularly mentioned bringing a friend who appreciates gardens." Miss Marple straightened up carefully from where she had been inspecting some winter-flowering hellebores, one hand pressing against the small of her back. "Snowdrops? At Thornwell Lodge?" She regarded her friend with mild interest, her faded blue eyes thoughtful. "That would be Mrs. Lavinia Dean, would it not? The lady who moved here last spring after her husband died." "The very same," said Mrs. Bantry, following Miss Marple into the cottage and removing her gloves. "She has quite a collection, apparently. Some extremely rare varieties. People write to her from all over England about them." "How very interesting," murmured Miss Marple, putting the kettle on. "I know very little about snowdrops beyond the common variety that grows in the churchyard." Mrs. Bantry warmed her hands at the fire. "Well, these are special ones with long Latin names, Galanthus something or other. Her companion is said to be rather a quiet little thing, and I thought the conversation might be thin if it were just the two of us discussing bulbs. Do say you will come, Jane." "I should be delighted," said Miss Marple. "I have often admired Thornwell Lodge from the outside. Such a handsome Georgian house." At precisely 3 o'clock that afternoon, Mrs. Bantry's car drew up outside Thornwell Lodge. They were admitted by a young maid with a pert expression, whom Mrs. Dean addressed as Rose, and shown into a well-appointed drawing-room that spoke of both wealth and taste. Mrs. Lavinia Dean was a tall, commanding woman of about 65, with iron-grey hair arranged in a style that must have taken considerable time and attention. She wore a handsome dress of purple silk, with a string of pearls that Miss Marple, with her eye for such things, recognized as both genuine and valuable. "Mrs. Bantry, how very nice, and you must be Miss Marple. I have heard of you from Canon Prescott. He speaks most highly of your work with the St. Mary Mead Charitable Society." Miss Marple inclined her head modestly. "The Canon is too kind. I do very little, really." Mrs. Dean rang for tea and gestured for them to be seated. "My companion, Miss Fairweather, will join us presently. She is just finishing some correspondence for me." The room was tastefully furnished with several pieces that Miss Marple recognized as valuable antiques, and a number of silver ornaments, and miniature paintings from India were arranged on various tables. "My late husband was in the Indian Army," explained Mrs. Dean, following Miss Marple's gaze. "We spent many years in Poona and Delhi." The door opened to admit a slight figure in a neat grey dress. Alice Fairweather was a young woman of perhaps 30, with light brown hair drawn back in a rather severe style that did little to flatter her pale, unremarkable features. "Ah, here is Miss Fairweather now," said Mrs. Dean. "Alice, do come and meet our visitors. Mrs. Bantry you know already, and this is her friend, Miss Marple." Miss Fairweather greeted them with a nervous smile and took her place behind the tea tray. Miss Marple noticed that her hands were well-shaped, but reddened slightly at the knuckles, suggesting that she had not always been a lady's companion. She handled the silver teapot with a care that spoke of its unfamiliarity. Their tea was interrupted by the arrival of a tall, thin man carrying a notebook, whom Mrs. Dean introduced as Gerald Fletcher, a botanist writing a monograph on unusual snowdrop varieties. "Miss Fairweather, another cup, if you please," said Mrs. Dean. "Mr. Fletcher has been absolutely fascinated by my Galanthus byzantinus. It has the most unusual green markings on the inner petals." Mr. Fletcher adjusted his spectacles and regarded them with a rather intense expression. "Indeed, most unusual. Only 3 verified specimens in the country. I was just making some notes on the variations in the markings when I saw you had visitors." Before they could continue, they were interrupted once more by the entrance of a young man of about 35, with the kind of handsome, dissipated face that Miss Marple had observed often led to trouble among impressionable young women. "Edwin!" Mrs. Dean's voice held a distinct note of surprise and perhaps displeasure. "I had no idea you were coming today." "Just passing through, Aunt Lavinia," he said lightly. "Thought I'd drop in to see how you were getting along." He turned a charming smile on the visitors. "Edwin Craddock, Mrs. Dean's nephew." "How do you do?" Miss Marple did not miss the slight tremor in Miss Fairweather's hands as she poured another cup of tea, nor the careful way in which both she and Edwin avoided looking directly at one another while he thanked her, behavior that reminded her forcibly of Ellen Cartwright and the butcher's son who had courted her in secret against her father's wishes. After tea, Mrs. Dean led them into the garden to view her famous snowdrops. Despite the chill of the February afternoon, Miss Marple found herself genuinely interested in the delicate white flowers with their varied green markings. "This variety is particularly rare," said Mrs. Dean, indicating a clump of snowdrops near a small garden shed. "Only 3 known specimens in England." "Fascinating, quite fascinating," murmured Mr. Fletcher, making another note in his book. "I obtained these bulbs from Sir George Carstairs' collection," Mrs. Dean continued, clearly pleased with the interest her garden was generating. "They require very specific conditions to thrive." The garden tour concluded with a visit to a small heated greenhouse, where Mrs. Dean cultivated certain delicate specimens. They were just returning to the house when Rose came hurrying across the lawn, her face flushed with agitation. "Ma'am! Ma'am!" she called. "It's gone missing!" "What has, Rose? Do compose yourself," said Mrs. Dean with a touch of sharpness. "Your gold locket, ma'am, the one with the diamonds. I was cleaning in your room as you asked, and I noticed the jewellery case was open and the locket wasn't there." Mrs. Dean's face paled visibly. "Are you quite sure? Perhaps I moved it." "No, ma'am. I saw it this morning when I brought your breakfast tray. And—" Here Rose hesitated, glancing nervously at Miss Fairweather. "And what? Speak up, girl," commanded Mrs. Dean. "I saw Miss Fairweather coming out of your room just before luncheon, ma'am," said Rose in a rush. There was a moment of shocked silence. Miss Fairweather's face went first red, then white. I was leaving a letter on your dressing table," she said faintly. "The one to the Garden Society about the spring showing. You asked me to write it this morning." "Indeed I did," said Mrs. Dean, but her voice held a new note of suspicion. Miss Marple, watching the tableau before her, was reminded of something that nagged at the edge of her memory like a loose thread in knitting. But what it was she could not quite recall. She observed Miss Fairweather's distress with thoughtful eyes, noting how the young woman's reaction seemed somehow disproportionate to the accusation, as if it touched on some deeper anxiety. Mrs. Bantry, ever conscious of social awkwardness, glanced at her watch. "My goodness, is that the time? We really must be going, Jane. Thank you so much for the delightful tea, Mrs. Dean, and for showing us your remarkable snowdrops. As they took their leave, Miss Marple cast one last glance back at the house. In the drawing-room window she could see Mrs. Dean gesturing emphatically as she spoke to Miss Fairweather, whose head was bowed in what might have been submission or distress. "Well, that ended awkwardly," remarked Mrs. Bantry as they drove away. "What do you make of it, Jane? Do you think that companion could have taken the locket?" Miss Marple gazed thoughtfully at the winter landscape passing by the car window. "I really couldn't say, Dolly, but it does remind me a little of something that happened when Mrs. Elkins accused her housemaid of taking a silver teaspoon." "And had she?" "No. Mrs. Elkins found it later in the sugar bowl, but the poor girl had left in tears by then. It is so very easy to accuse, and so very difficult to unaccuse, if you understand what I mean." As they rounded the corner past St. Mary Mead's small post office, Miss Marple found her thoughts returning to Alice Fairweather's face. There had been something in her expression, not merely the distress of being unjustly accused, but something deeper. Something, Miss Marple felt sure, that had to do with Edwin Craddock and the way they had so carefully avoided acknowledging one another. Chapter 2. An Unfortunate Incident. Miss Marple was arranging a small vase of winter aconites on her windowsill 2 days after the visit to Thornwell Lodge when the telephone rang. She placed the vase carefully on the sill, adjusting it slightly before moving to answer the call. "Jane, it's Dolly Bantry." The voice on the other end held a note that made Miss Marple's fingers tighten on the receiver. "Have you heard? That poor girl at Mrs. Dean's, Miss Fairweather, she's dead?" "Dead?" echoed Miss Marple. "But how? She seemed in perfect health when we saw her." "They're saying it was sleeping draught, an overdose. She was found this morning by Rose when she took up her morning tea." Mrs. Bantry lowered her voice, though there was no one to overhear. "They're saying she left a note. About that locket, you remember? Apparently she couldn't live with the shame." Miss Marple was silent for a moment, her mind turning over this new information with the methodical care she applied to her knitting patterns. "Are you still there, Jane?" "Yes, I was just thinking," said Miss Marple slowly. "It seems rather precipitate, does it not? To take one's life over a piece of jewellery?" "Well, it wasn't just any trinket. Colonel Dean gave it to his wife on their 25th wedding anniversary. Diamonds and so forth. And there was a photograph inside that Mrs. Dean valued particularly." "I see," said Miss Marple, though her tone suggested she saw rather more than she was saying. "I think I shall pay a call on Mrs. Dean, to express my condolences, of course." When Miss Marple arrived at Thornwell Lodge an hour later, she found the house in considerable disarray. Inspector Slack's police car was parked in the drive, and Constable Peters was standing importantly by the front door. "Good morning, Constable," said Miss Marple pleasantly. "Such a sad business. I've come to offer my condolences to Mrs. Dean. We met at a small tea party the day before yesterday." "Yes, Miss Marple," said Constable Peters, with the air of a young man who felt the weight of his responsibilities. "Inspector Slack is inside now. I don't know if Mrs. Dean will be receiving visitors." "Perhaps you might inquire," suggested Miss Marple gently. "I shan't be in the way." After a moment's hesitation, the constable went inside, returning shortly to escort her to the drawing-room where they had taken tea 2 days earlier. The room now had a subdued atmosphere, with Mrs. Dean seated stiffly on the sofa, her face pale but composed. Inspector Slack, a thick-set man with a brusque manner that Miss Marple had encountered before, was standing by the fireplace. He gave a short nod of recognition. "Miss Marple." "Inspector Slack. How do you do?" She turned to Mrs. Dean. "I hope you will forgive this intrusion, Mrs. Dean, but when I heard the sad news, I felt I must come to express my sympathies." "Very kind of you." said Mrs. Dean mechanically. She gestured to a chair. "Do sit down." Miss Marple took the chair indicated, noting the untouched tea tray on the table. It must have been a terrible shock. Yes, most unexpected. Rose found her at 8 o'clock this morning. The doctor says she must have taken the sleeping draught sometime after midnight. "Dr. Haydock has examined her?" asked Miss Marple, mentioning the village doctor whom she had known for many years. "Yes, he was called immediately," said Mrs. Dean. "He says there can be no doubt. The bottle of sleeping draught was beside her bed, nearly empty." "And the note?" inquired Inspector Slack, turning his attention back to Mrs. Dean. "It was on her dressing table. Just a few lines, saying she was sorry for the trouble she had caused, and that she couldn't bear the shame of being suspected of theft." Mrs. Dean's voice trembled slightly. "Such a foolish thing. I would never have dismissed her without clear evidence." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly in her head as she sorted the threads of this narrative. "Was the locket found?" Inspector Slack gave her a sharp look. As a matter of fact, it was. In Miss Fairweather's hat box, wrapped in a handkerchief. She must have hidden it there after taking it. "I see," said Miss Marple again. "May I ask, is your nephew still visiting Mrs. Dean?" "Edwin? No, he left yesterday afternoon. He was most upset to hear the news. I telephoned him in London this morning." At that moment, Dr. Haydock entered the room. He was a spare, grey-haired man with a lined face and shrewd eyes that brightened at the sight of Miss Marple. "Miss Marple, I didn't expect to see you here," he said, taking her extended hand. "I came to offer my condolences to Mrs. Dean. I was here for tea the day before yesterday." "Ah, yes. Well, I've completed my examination, Inspector," he said, turning to Slack. "As I thought, death from an overdose of veronal. The poor girl must have taken it around midnight or shortly after." "And, in your opinion, it was self-administered?" asked the inspector. Dr. Haydock hesitated almost imperceptibly. "The evidence certainly suggests so," he said carefully. "The bottle was beside her bed, and there were traces of the draught in a glass on her nightstand." Miss Marple watched the doctor with interest. His careful phrasing suggested a medical man who would not commit himself beyond what he could strictly verify. She had known Dr. Haydock for many years and respected his judgment. "With your permission, Mrs. Dean, I should like to see where Miss Fairweather was found," said Inspector Slack. "Just to complete my report." Mrs. Dean rose. "Of course. This way, Inspector." As they left the room, Miss Marple turned to Dr. Haydock. "You knew Miss Fairweather, Doctor?" "Yes, slightly. She came to see me last week about headaches. Seemed a nervous sort of young woman. Highly strung, I would say." "Did she give you any indication that she might—" Miss Marple let the question trail, off delicately. "Take her own life?" Dr. Haydock shook his head. "Not at all. In fact—" He paused, then said more quietly. "In confidence, Miss Marple, she seemed afraid of something. She asked me if I thought sleeping draughts were dangerous." "Indeed," said Miss Marple with interest. "And what did you tell her?" "That they should be used with caution, naturally. She seemed relieved when I said they were safe if taken as prescribed." Their conversation was interrupted by the return of Inspector Slack, followed by Mrs. Dean and Rose, the latter red-eyed from weeping. "Most unsatisfactory," muttered the inspector. "Open window, footstool out of place. Most untidy for a suicide." "Miss Fairweather was very neat in her habits," offered Rose, then shrank back as the inspector's gaze fell on her. "The open window might be explained by the need for air," suggested Mrs. Dean. "The rooms get rather stuffy with the central heating." Miss Marple noticed a small white petal on the carpet near the door and bent to pick it up. "How lovely. A snowdrop, I believe." "Oh, those," said Rose. "Miss Fairweather had some in a little vase on her dressing table, They must have fallen when the constable was examining the room. Miss Marple examined the delicate petal between her fingers, then glanced at the slippers Mrs. Dean was wearing. Pale blue satin with a small snowdrop design embroidered on them. She returned the petal to Rose with a smile. "Such sad circumstances," she murmured. "I really must not intrude any longer, Mrs. Dean. Please accept my sincere condolences." As Miss Marple walked back to the village, she found her thoughts turning over the various details she had observed. The open window that Inspector Slack had found suspicious, the displaced footstool, the snowdrop petals on the carpet, and most of all, Dr. Haydock's revelation about Miss Fairweather's fear. None of it suggested the actions of a young woman planning to take her own life out of shame over a petty theft. She was still pondering these inconsistencies when she met Miss Beatrice Webb coming out of the post office, a thin, bird-like woman with bright, inquisitive eyes, who served as the village's most reliable source of gossip. "Miss Marple, have you heard about the tragic event at Thornwell Lodge?" Miss Webb clutched her arm eagerly. "Yes, I have just come from there," said Miss Marple. "Such a sad business. Dreadful, and so unexpected. Though I must say there have been odd goings-on at that house since Mrs. Dean arrived. Did you know she dismissed her previous companion quite suddenly? Miss Bellingham, Maud Bellingham, such a respectable woman from a good family. Been with her for years, apparently, then turned off at a moment's notice 6 months ago." Miss Marple's interest quickened. "Indeed? I had not heard that. Do you know why she was dismissed?" "No one knows," said Miss Webb with evident satisfaction at being the bearer of such intriguing information. "Miss Bellingham left without a word to anyone, though Mrs. Pierce at the baker's says she's been seen back in the village this past week, staying at the Blue Boar, I believe." Miss Marple absorbed this information thoughtfully. As she continued her walk home, she found herself remembering Alice Fairweather's face when Edwin Craddock had entered the room. Not merely the embarrassment of two people hiding an acquaintance, but something closer to fear. Chapter 3. Whispers from the Past. The following morning found Miss Marple knitting by her window, her needles moving with practiced precision as she glanced occasionally at the birds visiting her garden feeder. Her mind, however, was not on her knitting pattern, but on the curious circumstances of Alice Fairweather's death. The sound of the garden gate opening caused her to look up. It was Mrs. Bantry, wrapped in a thick coat against the February chill. "Jane, I simply had to come and tell you," she began as soon as Miss Marple had ushered her inside and taken her coat. "The village is absolutely buzzing with talk about poor Miss Fairweather." "I imagine it would be," said Miss Marple mildly, pouring tea for them both. "A sudden death is always cause for speculation. Inspector Slack is calling it suicide, but there are whispers." Mrs. Bantry leaned forward confidentially. Rose, the maid at Thornwell Lodge, told her cousin, who works for the Hardcastles, that Miss Fairweather seemed perfectly normal the evening before. She even asked what time breakfast would be served in the morning. "Not the action of someone planning to take their own life," murmured Miss Marple. "Exactly, and there's more. Rose says the locket was indeed found in Miss Fairweather's possession, just as the inspector said, but she thinks it may have been planted there." Miss Marple's needles paused momentarily. "Does she indeed? What makes her think so?" "She says Miss Fairweather's room was always immaculately tidy. She would never have hidden something in her hat box. She hardly used hats at all. Rose thinks someone must have put it there to incriminate her." Miss Marple considered this information thoughtfully. "I believe I might pay a visit to the vicarage this morning," she said at length. "Reverend Clement has been vicar here for nearly 20 years. He might know something of Miss Fairweather's background." After Mrs. Bantry's departure, Miss Marple put on her coat and walked the short distance to the vicarage. The Reverend Leonard Clement received her in his study, a comfortable room lined with books and warmed by a small coal fire. "Miss Marple, what a pleasant surprise! What brings you here on such a cold morning?" "I wondered, Vicar, if you might have known anything of Miss Fairweather, the young lady who died at Thornwell Lodge." The vicar's kindly face grew serious. "A most unfortunate business. Yes, I knew Miss Fairweather slightly. She attended services occasionally and came to speak with me privately about 2 weeks ago." "Indeed?" Miss Marple's interest quickened. "May I ask what about?" "I'm afraid I cannot say, Miss Marple. It was a matter of confidence." He hesitated, then added, "I can tell you that she seemed troubled. She asked about the nature of forgiveness and whether past mistakes could truly be left behind." "Spiritual guidance, then?" said Miss Marple thoughtfully. "Did she mention anyone from her past? Mr. Craddock, perhaps?" "I really cannot say more," said the vicar firmly. "But I will tell you this. She struck me as a young woman who was trying earnestly to make amends for something in her past. Not at all the sort of person who would take her own life." Miss Marple nodded, accepting his discretion. "Thank you, Vicar. You've been most helpful." Her next stop was a small, rather dingy shop on the High Street that bore the name Hawthorne Antiques and Curios in faded gold lettering on its window. A bell jangled as she entered, and from the dimness at the back of the shop emerged a tall man with a slightly stooped posture and thinning hair. He had the soft, well-manicured hands of someone who handled delicate objects. "Good morning, madam. Basil Hawthorne at your service. How may I help you?" Miss Marple produced from her handbag a small brooch of no particular value. "I wondered if you might tell me what you think of this. It belonged to my mother." Mr. Hawthorne examined the piece with professional interest. "Victorian, circa 1880. Mourning jewellery, not particularly rare. I could offer you perhaps £5 for it." "Oh, I couldn't possibly sell it," said Miss Marple. "It has such sentimental value. I understand you deal with Mrs. Dean at Thornwell Lodge." The change in his expression was subtle but unmistakable. "Occasionally. Mrs. Dean has some fine pieces from India. Such a tragedy about her companion," continued Miss Marple. "Did you know Miss Fairweather at all?" "By sight only." His manner had grown distinctly more reserved. "I understand you're interested in antique lockets, Miss—" "Marple. Jane Marple." "Oh, no, not particularly, though I did notice Mrs. Dean had a very fine one that has unfortunately gone missing." "Indeed? I hadn't heard." His tone suggested the conversation was at an end. "If you change your mind about the brooch, my offer stands." As Miss Marple left the shop, she noticed a familiar figure entering the post office across the street. Edwin Craddock. She watched as he purchased stamps and posted a letter, then approached him as he emerged. "Mr. Craddock, isn't it? We met at your aunt's house the day before yesterday. I am Miss Marple, a friend of Mrs. Bantry." "Oh yes, of course." His smile was charming, but did not quite reach his eyes. "Terrible business about Miss Fairweather. I've just come back to help Aunt Lavinia with the arrangements." "Very considerate of you. I understand you were in London when it happened?" "Yes, I left the morning before. Business matters, you know." He glanced at his watch. "If you'll excuse me, Miss Marple, I promised Aunt Lavinia I wouldn't be long." Miss Marple watched him walk away, noting his expensive but slightly worn clothing and the nervous way he glanced over his shoulder. His behaviour reminded her irresistibly of young Fred Timmins, who had always had a plausible explanation for his whereabouts just before something went missing in the village. Kaish. Ruminations were interrupted by the sight of Inspector Slack emerging from the police station. He frowned slightly upon seeing her. "Good morning, Inspector." She greeted him pleasantly. "Miss Marple, I hope you're not involving yourself in police matters again." "Oh dear me, no," said Miss Marple with a gentle smile. I was just doing some shopping. Have you made progress with your investigation? The inspector's expression became slightly smug. As a matter of fact, we have. The missing locket has been found among Miss Fairweather's possessions, just as I suspected. Case closed, in my opinion. Theft followed by remorse. How very neat, murmured Miss Marple. May I ask, was there anything in the locket? Mrs. Bantry mentioned a photograph. Nothing. Empty. Mrs. Dean says the photograph must have fallen out when the locket was taken. Now, if you'll excuse me. As Inspector Slack strode away, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to what she had learned. The vicar's reluctance to discuss the content of his conversation with Miss Fairweather, Mr. Hawthorne's discomfort at the mention of the locket, Edwin Craddock's hasty return from London, and now the empty locket. Each piece was like a stitch in a complex pattern, but the design was not yet clear. She decided to pay one more call before returning home. 15 minutes later, she was seated in Dr. Haydock's consulting room. I'm not ill, Doctor, she explained. I merely wish to ask you a little more about Miss Fairweather's visit to you last week. Dr. Haydock regarded her shrewdly. You don't believe it was suicide, do you, Miss Marple? I find certain aspects puzzling, she admitted. You mentioned she seemed afraid of something and asked about sleeping draughts. Yes, and there's something else I didn't mention yesterday. She asked me if I knew of anyone in the village named Craddock before Mrs. Dean arrived. I told her I didn't, but the question seemed significant to her. Most interesting, said Miss Marple softly. And did she say anything else that struck you as unusual? She asked if I believed in coincidences. When I said they happen all the time, she said, not this kind. I asked her what she meant, but she wouldn't elaborate. As Miss Marple walked home, she mulled over everything she had learned. The picture was becoming clearer, though many pieces were still missing. She was convinced that Alice Fairweather's death was connected to something in her past, something that involved Edwin Craddock and perhaps the mysterious previous companion, Maud Bellingham. She paused by the lich gate of St. Mary Mead Church, her eye caught by the clumps of snowdrops growing in the churchyard. Simple, innocent flowers, yet they reminded her of the petals found in Alice Fairweather's room. Like those delicate blooms, Miss Fairweather had presented a simple exterior to the world, but Miss Marple was increasingly certain that beneath that exterior lay secrets that someone had been desperate to keep hidden. Chapter 4. Secrets in the Garden. The telephone rang shortly after Miss Marple had finished her breakfast the following morning. Miss Marple? Lavinia Dean speaking? The voice had a brittle quality that suggested its owner was under strain. I wonder if I might impose upon your expertise. Mrs. Bantry tells me you are quite knowledgeable about gardening. That is very kind of Dolly, but I'm afraid my knowledge is quite limited, said Miss Marple modestly. Nonsense. She says your garden is the envy of St. Mary Mead. The thing is, poor Miss Fairweather was helping me catalogue my snowdrop collection, and now that she's... Well, I find myself rather at a loss. I wondered if you might be willing to assist me, just for an hour or two this morning? Miss Marple recognized the opportunity at once. I should be delighted to help if I can, Mrs. Dean, though I must warn you that snowdrops are not my specialty. Excellent. Shall we say 11 o'clock? At precisely 11, Miss Marple was admitted to Thornwell Lodge by Rose, whose red-rimmed eyes suggested she was still grieving for Miss Fairweather. The girl led her through to the garden, where Mrs. Dean was already waiting, dressed in a practical tweed suit and sturdy boots. How good of you to come, Miss Marple. I have the catalogue here and some labels. We were documenting the different varieties and their locations in the garden. A most sensible approach, said Miss Marple, accepting the notebook. As she leafed through it, she recognized Alice Fairweather's neat, precise handwriting. The last entry had been made only the day before her death, hardly the action of someone planning suicide. For the next hour, they worked companionably in the garden, Miss Marple noting down the locations of different varieties, while Mrs. Dean identified them. They were examining a clump of snowdrops near the garden shed when Miss Marple noticed something unusual. "These appear to have been recently disturbed," she observed, pointing to the earth around several bulbs, which showed signs of having been dug up and replanted. "Oh, that must have been Gerald Fletcher," said Mrs. Dean quickly. "He asked permission to examine some of the bulbs more closely for his monograph. I believe he took photographs of the root structures." Miss Marple nodded, though she noted that the soil disturbance appeared very recent indeed. As they worked their way around the garden, she observed similar signs in several other places, all involving the rarer varieties. "Mr. Fletcher seems very interested in your collection," she remarked casually. "Yes, he's writing a definitive work on unusual galanthus varieties. He's been most persistent about documenting mine." Mrs. Dean hesitated, then added, "Between ourselves, Miss Marple, I sometimes wonder if his interest might be more commercial than academic. Some of these bulbs are quite valuable to collectors." They had nearly completed the catalogue when Florence Simmons, the housekeeper, appeared at the garden door. She was a tall, austere woman in her 50s, with iron-grey hair pulled back in a severe bun, and sharp features that reminded Miss Marple of a school matron she had once known. "Excuse me, ma'am, but Mr. Edwin has arrived, and there's a policeman asking to speak with you." Mrs. Dean sighed. "I'll come at once. Miss Marple, would you mind waiting in the drawing-room? I shan't be long." Left alone momentarily, Miss Marple took the opportunity to examine the garden shed. The door was unlocked, and inside she found the usual gardening implements, pots, and soil. What caught her attention, however, was a small notebook that had fallen behind a stack of clay pots. She retrieved it carefully and saw that it contained handwritten notes in what appeared to be Gerald Fletcher's writing, judging by the botanical terms. As she replaced it, she noticed something else. A cigarette end of a distinctive brand she had seen Edwin Craddock smoking during their previous visit. On her way back to the house, she passed Florence emerging from the side door. The housekeeper was carrying something wrapped in a cloth, which she quickly placed in the dustbin before returning inside. Miss Marple, her curiosity aroused, glanced into the bin as she passed, and glimpsed what appeared to be broken fragments of porcelain. A small vase, perhaps. In the drawing-room, Miss Marple found Edwin Craddock pacing nervously. "Miss Marple, I didn't expect to see you here again," he said, his surprise evident. "Mrs. Dean asked me to help with her snowdrop catalogue," she explained. "Miss Fairweather had been assisting her with it." "Ah, yes, poor Alice." His expression was difficult to read. "A terrible business." "You knew her before, I think?" Miss Marple ventured, watching his face closely. A flash of alarm crossed his features before he carefully composed them. "No, why would you think that?" "Oh, merely an impression I had. You both seemed somewhat awkward when you met at tea." "Did we? I didn't notice." He glanced towards the door. "I wonder what's keeping Aunt Lavinia." Miss Marple changed tack. "Have you been in St. Mary Mead before, Mr. Craddock? The village seems to suit your aunt very well." "No, never. This is quite my first visit to this part of the country," he replied, a little too emphatically. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Mrs. Dean, accompanied by Constable Peters. "Edwin, there you are. I'm afraid I have some disturbing news. My pearl necklace has gone missing now." "Another theft?" Edwin looked genuinely shocked. "But surely not Miss Fairweather this time." "No, of course not, but it's most perplexing. I wore it only 2 days ago." She turned to the constable. "I've given you all the details. Please inform Inspector Slack." After Constable Peters had departed, Mrs. Dean turned to Miss Marple. I must apologize for the interruption. Would you care to stay for luncheon? That is most kind, but I really should be getting back. Mrs. Bantry is expecting me for tea. Miss Marple rose, gathering her things. I do hope your necklace turns up, Mrs. Dean. It seems unlikely after the business with the locket. Mrs. Dean sighed. Such a curious thing. The locket was returned empty. The photograph it contained was of my late husband. It had great sentimental value. On her way out, Miss Marple accidentally, quite accidentally of course, took a wrong turn and found herself in a corridor leading to what must be the guest bedrooms. One door stood slightly ajar, and she glimpsed Edwin Craddock's jacket hanging on a chair. On an impulse, she stepped into the room, her sharp eyes quickly taking in the details: the half-packed suitcase, the stack of correspondence on the desk, and most interestingly, a train timetable with several circled departures. A sound in the corridor caused her to step back quickly, and she nearly collided with Gerald Fletcher, who was emerging from another room. "Oh, I do beg your pardon," she exclaimed. "I was looking for the cloakroom." "It's at the other end of the hall," he informed her, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Were you just in Craddock's room?" "Was I? How foolish of me! These old houses can be so confusing, can't they?" She smiled apologetically and made her way past him. That afternoon, Miss Marple related her discoveries to Mrs. Bantry over tea. "The whole business reminds me rather of the Thompson family scandal," she remarked, pouring a second cup. "You remember, when old Mrs. Thompson's companion was found to have been living under a false name?" "I can't say I do remember," said Mrs. Bantry. "What happened?" "It was hushed up, of course, but it transpired that the young woman had once been involved with Mrs. Thompson's son. She had taken the position to be near him again, though he wanted nothing more to do with her. Quite a different situation from our present case, naturally, but it does make one think about hidden connections." Mrs. Bantry looked puzzled. "I don't see the similarity at all." "Perhaps not," said Miss Marple, her needles clicking steadily. "But there's something about this case that isn't quite what it seems. Those disturbed snowdrops, for instance, and the empty locket, and now another missing piece of jewellery." As Miss Marple walked home later, she mulled over the various threads of information she had gathered. The most intriguing new development was learning that Maud Bellingham, Mrs. Dean's former companion, had been seen back in the village, staying at the Blue Boar. Miss Marple decided that her next step must be to seek out this woman, who might hold important clues to the mystery surrounding Alice Fairweather's death. Chapter 5. The Second Disappearance. The morning after her visit to Thornwell Lodge, Miss Marple was engaged in tidying her work basket when the telephone rang. "Miss Marple, Inspector Slack here." The inspector's voice was brisk and official. "I understand from Mrs. Dean that you were at Thornwell Lodge yesterday assisting with some garden business." "Yes, indeed. Mrs. Dean asked me to help catalogue her snowdrop collection after Miss Fairweather's unfortunate death." "Did you happen to see anything unusual while you were there, particularly regarding Mrs. Dean's pearl necklace?" "No, Inspector, I'm afraid I didn't. Mrs. Dean was not wearing it yesterday, and I was primarily in the garden." There was a pause. "Very well. I'm conducting inquiries following this second theft. It's a curious business." After the inspector rang off, Miss Marple put on a coat and hat. She had decided overnight that she must speak with Maud Bellingham, the former companion who had been dismissed by Mrs. Dean 6 months earlier. The Blue Boar was a small inn on the outskirts of St. Mary Mead, primarily catering to commercial travellers and the occasional tourist. The landlord, a jovial man named Biggs, greeted her with surprise. "Why, Miss Marple, we don't often see you in here. What brings you to the Blue Boar this morning?" "I was hoping to speak with one of your guests, Mr. Biggs. A Miss Bellingham, I believe." "Ah, yes, she's staying with us. Room 4. Been here about a week now. Keeps herself pretty much to herself. Shall I see if she's in?" A few minutes later, Miss Marple was shown into a small private sitting room where a woman of about 40 was waiting. Maud Bellingham was thin and angular, with a perpetually anxious expression and nervous hands that continually adjusted her collar or smoothed her skirt. "Miss Marple, is it? I don't believe we've met." "No, we haven't had that pleasure. I'm a resident of St. Mary Mead. I hope you'll forgive this intrusion, but I wanted to speak with you about Mrs. Dean and her household." Miss Bellingham's face tightened. "I no longer have any connection with Mrs. Dean." "I understand you were her companion before Miss Fairweather?" "Yes, for 3 years, until 6 months ago." "May I ask why you left her employment?" Maud Bellingham hesitated, her fingers pleating the edge of her handkerchief. "I was dismissed, without a reference. Mrs. Dean claimed I had been neglectful of my duties." "Was that the true reason?" Miss Marple asked gently. "No." Miss Bellingham's voice was barely audible. "It was because I discovered something about Miss Fairweather, or rather about who she really was." "And who was she really?" Miss Bellingham shook her head. "I can't say. I promised I wouldn't, but it was something that would have greatly upset Mrs. Dean if she had known." She looked up suddenly, her expression changing. "Is it true she's dead? Miss Fairweather, I mean?" "Yes, I'm afraid. So, the police are calling it suicide." "Suicide?" Miss Bellingham looked genuinely shocked. "I can't believe that. She wasn't the type." "That was my impression as well," said Miss Marple. "May I ask why you've returned to St. Mary Mead?" Miss Bellingham faltered. "I received a letter from Miss Fairweather. She asked me to meet her, said she needed my help, but when I arrived I learned she was dead." As Miss Marple walked back to the village, she reflected on this new information. If Alice Fairweather had written to Maud Bellingham asking for help, it suggested she had felt herself to be in danger. But what kind of danger? And what secret had Miss Bellingham discovered about her? Miss Marple's musings were interrupted by the sight of Mrs. Bantry hurrying toward her from the direction of Thornwell Lodge. "Jane, the most extraordinary thing has happened. Gerald Fletcher has disappeared." "Disappeared?" "Yes, vanished without a word, and Mrs. Dean has discovered that several of her rarest snowdrop bulbs are missing as well, the ones he was so interested in." "Indeed?" Miss Marple looked thoughtful. "When did this happen?" "Sometime last night, apparently. He was staying at Thornwell Lodge, you know. His room was empty this morning, and his car is gone. Mrs. Dean is beside herself. First the locket, then the pearls, now her precious bulbs. Most distressing," agreed Miss Marple. "I wonder if Inspector Slack has been informed." "Oh yes, she telephoned him straight away. But honestly, Jane, what do you make of it? Could this Fletcher person have been responsible for the thefts all along? And possibly even for Miss Fairweather's death? It seems a rather extreme measure to kill someone merely to steal some flower bulbs, however rare." "Well, when you put it like that." Mrs. Bantry looked disappointed. "But what other explanation could there be?" "I think I might pay a visit to Dr. Haydock," said Miss Marple. "There are 1 or 2 points I'd like to clarify about Miss Fairweather's death." Dr. Haydock was just finishing his morning surgery when Miss Marple arrived. He ushered her into his consulting room with a knowing smile. "I've been expecting you, Miss Marple. I take it you're still not satisfied with the official verdict on Miss Fairweather's death." "There are certain aspects that trouble me," she admitted. "For one thing, Inspector Slack mentioned an open window in her room." "Yes, and a displaced footstool," said Dr. Haydock, "neither of which is consistent with the fastidious habits Miss Fairweather displayed in life, according to the maid." "Precisely. And then there's the matter of the sleeping draught itself." "Ah." Dr. Haydock leaned back in his chair. "I wondered if you would pick up on that. The bottle found beside her bed contained veronal, a barbiturate commonly prescribed for insomnia. But when Miss Fairweather consulted me about her headaches, I prescribed aspirin only. I never gave her veronal or Any other sleeping draught. So the bottle wasn't hers? Apparently not. And there's something else. The post-mortem revealed a high concentration of the drug, far more than would be necessary to induce sleep. Someone either deliberately or accidentally administered a fatal dose. Miss Marple absorbed this information, her suspicion that Alice Fairweather had been murdered now confirmed. Thank you, Doctor. You've been most helpful. Her next stop was the parish church, where she found the Reverend Clement sorting through hymn books. Miss Marple, good morning. What brings you to St. Mary Mead Church on a weekday? I was hoping, Vicar, that you might allow me to look at the parish records, specifically the baptism records for the years 1915 to 1925. The vicar looked surprised, but agreed to her request. In the small vestry, he produced several leather-bound volumes. May I ask what you're looking for? I'm not entirely sure, said Miss Marple truthfully. Just a hunch, really. Left alone, she began carefully examining the records. It took her nearly an hour of methodical searching before she found what she was looking for, an entry from 1919 that made her pause. She copied down the information carefully in her small notebook, then closed the volume and thanked the vicar for his assistance. As she walked home, Miss Marple's mind was busy arranging and rearranging the pieces of the puzzle. The parish record had provided a crucial connection, one that explained why Alice Fairweather might have recognized someone in St. Mary Mead, and possibly why that person had been desperate enough to kill her. She was just turning into her garden gate when she saw Inspector Slack striding purposefully up the lane toward her. "Ah, Miss Marple. I was on my way to see you." "How convenient, Inspector. I was just about to put the kettle on." Inside her cottage, Miss Marple served tea while the inspector shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "I've had a report from London," he said finally. "It appears that this Gerald Fletcher is not what he seemed. There is no botanist by that name registered with any of the horticultural societies, and the address he gave Mrs. Dean is fictitious." "How interesting," murmured Miss Marple. "Furthermore, we've located Miss Bellingham at the Blue Boar. She claims Miss Fairweather wrote to her asking for help. She also says that Miss Fairweather was living under a false identity." "Yes, I had gathered as much from my own conversation with her this morning," said Miss Marple calmly. Inspector Slack looked annoyed. "I might have known you'd already been there. I don't suppose she told you who Miss Fairweather really was?" "No, she was quite reticent on that point, but I believe I may have discovered the answer elsewhere." Miss Marple hesitated, then continued. "Inspector, have you considered the possibility that Miss Fairweather's death was not suicide?" The evidence was arranged to look like suicide," said Miss Marple firmly. "But Dr. Haydock tells me the sleeping draught found by her bed was not one he had prescribed for her. And there are other inconsistencies: the open window, the displaced footstool, and now this letter to Miss Bellingham asking for help." Inspector Slack frowned, but Miss Marple could see that her words had made an impression. "I'll speak to Dr. Haydock again," he said reluctantly. "In the meantime, keep your theories to yourself, Miss Marple. We don't want to alarm the neighborhood unnecessarily." After the inspector had departed, Miss Marple sat for a long time by her window, knitting steadily as she considered all she had learned. The picture was becoming clearer, but there were still gaps to be filled. She thought of the snowdrop petals found in Alice Fairweather's room, the disturbed bulbs in the garden, and the mysterious botanist who had disappeared. Somehow she felt sure these seemingly unrelated elements were connected to the secret from Alice Fairweather's past, a secret someone had been willing to kill to protect. Chapter 6. Patterns of Deception. The following morning found Miss Marple seated by her window, her knitting needles moving steadily as she sorted through the tangled threads of the case in her mind. The facts, like her wool, had seemed at first to be a hopeless muddle, but gradually a pattern was emerging. She had just completed a row when Mrs. Bantry appeared at her garden gate. "Jane, have you heard the latest? Edwin Craddock has disappeared now." Miss Marple ushered her friend inside. "Disappeared? When?" "Last night, apparently. Mrs. Dean telephoned me in quite a state. First that Fletcher person vanishes with her precious bulbs, and now her nephew has gone without a word. And there's more. Some silver from the drawing-room is missing, too." "How very disturbing for Mrs. Dean," murmured Miss Marple, pouring tea. "Has she notified Inspector Slack?" "Oh yes, he's there now. Jane, what on earth is happening at Thornwell Lodge? 3 thefts and a death in the space of a week." Miss Marple's needles paused momentarily. "I believe I might pay a visit to Rose," she said thoughtfully. "The maid who found Miss Fairweather's body. There are 1 or 2 points I'd like to clarify." After Mrs. Bantry departed, Miss Marple set aside her knitting and put on her hat. Rose lived with her mother in a small cottage near the village green. Miss Marple found her hanging washing in the garden, looking pale and tired. "Miss Marple, I didn't expect to see you here." "I hope I'm not intruding, Rose. I just wanted to ask you a few questions about the morning you found Miss Fairweather." Rose glanced nervously at the house. "I've told the police everything." "I'm sure you have. But sometimes little details get overlooked. Things that might not seem important at the time." Miss Marple smiled reassuringly. "For instance, was there anything unusual about the evening before? Did Miss Fairweather receive any visitors or telephone calls?" Rose hesitated, then said, "Well, there was a telephone call, just after dinner. Miss Fairweather answered it herself. She happened to be passing through the hall. She looked quite shaken afterward. And then later, around 9 o'clock, I thought I heard a car in the drive, but when I looked out I couldn't see anything." "And the next morning, when you found her?" "It was just as I told the police. I took up her morning tea at 8, and when she didn't answer my knock, I went in and found her. Like that." Rose shuddered at the memory. The window was open, which was odd because it was so cold, and her footstool was in the middle of the room instead of by the armchair where she usually kept it. Was anything else out of place? Rose thought for a moment. The little vase of snowdrops on her dressing table was knocked over. There was water on the polished surface, and I had to wipe it up. And she broke off, looking uncertain. "Yes," prompted Miss Marple gently. "Well, her slippers. They had soil on them. Just a little, on the soles, as if she'd been outside in them, which didn't make sense because she was wearing her nightdress." Miss Marple absorbed this information with interest. "Thank you, Rose. You've been most helpful." Her next visit was to Mrs. Beatrice Webb, who lived in a cottage adjacent to Thornwell Lodge, and was known for her vigilant observation of her neighbours' comings and goings. "Miss Marple, what a pleasant surprise. Do come in." Once settled with tea and cake, Miss Marple guided the conversation skillfully toward the events at Thornwell Lodge. "Such a distressing business about Miss Fairweather," she remarked. "And now I hear Mr. Craddock has left suddenly as well." "Yes, in the middle of the night, if you please," said Mrs. Webb with evident relish. "I heard his car just after midnight. Most inconsiderate, the noise woke me from a sound sleep." "Midnight? Are you certain of the time?" "Absolutely. I looked at my bedside clock. It was 20 minutes past 12 exactly, and that wasn't the only disturbance that night." "Oh?" "Around 10 o'clock, I saw someone in Mrs. Dean's garden with a flashlight, near that shed where she keeps her gardening things. I assumed it was the gardener, though what he was doing there at that hour I can't imagine." Miss Marple's interest quickened. "Did you get a good look at this person?" "No, it was too dark, just a figure moving about with a flashlight. And then about an hour later, I heard voices from the direction of the greenhouse, a man and a woman speaking in low tones. I couldn't make out the words, but they seemed to be arguing." After leaving Mrs. Webb, Miss Marple walked to the railway station and consulted the timetable displayed there. The last train to London had departed at 11:45 p.m., which meant that if Edwin Craddock had left in his car at 12:20 a.m., he had not been catching that train. Where, then, had he been going? On her way back through the village, she encountered Constable Peters, who touched his helmet respectfully. "Good afternoon, Miss Marple. Nasty business at Thornwell Lodge, isn't it?" "Indeed, Constable. Has Inspector Slack made any progress?" "Well, between ourselves." The young officer leaned closer. "We've had a report from a pawnbroker in Eastborough. Seems Mr. Craddock tried to pawn some silver yesterday afternoon, matching the description of what's missing from Thornwell Lodge." "How very interesting. And has the inspector located him?" "Not yet, but there's an alert out for his car. The inspector thinks he might have been the one who took the locket and pearls as well, and planted the locket in Miss Fairweather's room to direct suspicion away from himself." "I see. And what about Mr. Fletcher? Any news of him?" "Nothing yet, miss. Seems he was using a false name. The inspector is looking into the possibility that he and Mr. Craddock might have been working together." After parting from Constable Peters, Miss Marple continued homeward, her mind busy. The pieces were falling into place, but there was still something missing, a motive that would explain not just the thefts, but Alice Fairweather's murder. For Miss Marple was now convinced beyond doubt that the young woman had been murdered, and that the key to the mystery lay in her true identity and her connection to someone in St. Mary Mead. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple consulted her notebook, where she had recorded the information from the parish records. She then made a brief telephone call to London, speaking to an old school friend who now worked at the records office. After replacing the receiver, she sat for a long moment, her face grave. Her suspicions had been confirmed, and she now understood the full pattern of events that had led to Alice Fairweather's death. She reached for her telephone once more and dialed Inspector Slack's number at the police station. "Inspector, Miss Marple here. I believe I know who killed Alice Fairweather and why. But we will need to act quickly, as I fear there may be another victim. Now, Miss Marple, we've had this conversation before about interfering in police investigations. Inspector?" Miss Marple interrupted firmly. "I have discovered that Alice Fairweather was not who she claimed to be. Her real name was Dorothy Lammerton, and she was born in St. Mary Mead. I believe she recognized someone here, someone who feared exposure and killed her to ensure her silence. The missing jewelry, the snowdrop bulbs, even Mr. Fletcher's disappearance, they're all distractions designed to obscure the true motive." There was a silence on the other end of the line. Then Inspector Slack said grudgingly, "I suppose you'd better come to the station and tell me what you know. I think it would be better if you were to come to my cottage tomorrow afternoon at 4, and perhaps you might bring Mrs. Dean, Mrs. Bantry, Dr. Haydock, and Miss Bellingham as well. I shall also invite Reverend Clement. Over tea, I believe we can get to the bottom of this matter." After a moment's hesitation, the inspector agreed, and Miss Marple replaced the receiver with a small sigh. She disliked being the bearer of unpleasant truths, but justice for Alice Fairweather, or Dorothy Lammerton, as she had been born, demanded that the truth be revealed. She picked up her knitting once more, her fingers deftly manipulating the needles as she mentally reviewed the case, ensuring that every stitch of her theory was secure. By tomorrow afternoon, the tangled skein would be unravelled, and the pattern of deception would be laid bare for all to see. Chapter 7. Miss Marple's Revelation. At precisely 4 o'clock the following afternoon, Miss Marple's cottage presented a scene that would have been familiar to readers of society magazines. A genteel tea party with cake stands, delicate china cups, and silver teapots. The atmosphere, however, was far from convivial. Inspector Slack stood awkwardly by the mantelpiece, clearly uncomfortable in such domestic surroundings. Mrs. Dean sat stiffly on the sofa, her face pale but composed. Beside her was Maud Bellingham, whose fingers nervously pleated the edge of her handkerchief. Dr. Haydock occupied an armchair near the fire, while the Reverend Clement and Mrs. Bantry completed the gathering. Miss Marple poured tea with steady hands. "Thank you all for coming. I know this has been a difficult time, particularly for you, Mrs. Dean. I must say, Miss Marple," began Inspector Slack, "this is all highly irregular. If you have information pertinent to the case, it should have been given directly to the police." "Oh, but I felt it would be so much clearer if everyone concerned could hear it together," said Miss Marple mildly. "You see, Inspector, when one lives in a village as long as I have, one becomes quite an expert in human nature. People are much the same everywhere, and certain patterns of behavior tend to repeat themselves." "Jane always says that," put in Mrs. Bantry. "And she's usually right, though I often can't see the parallels myself." Miss Marple smiled briefly at her friend. "When Miss Fairweather, or should I say, Miss Lammerton, was found dead, there were several curious features that suggested her death was not suicide. The open window on a cold night, the displaced footstool, the snowdrop petals on her slippers, and most tellingly, the fact that the sleeping draught found beside her bed was not one prescribed for her by Dr. Haydock." "Quite so," agreed the doctor. "I never gave her veronal or any other barbiturate. Then there was the missing locket, conveniently discovered in Miss Fairweather's possession after her death. And later the pearl necklace and the silver, all designed, I believe, to suggest that theft was the motive for any wrongdoing at Thornwell Lodge." "Are you suggesting my nephew was responsible?" asked Mrs. Dean sharply. "Mr. Craddock certainly took the silver," said Inspector Slack. "He was apprehended this morning attempting to leave the country, but whether he was involved in Miss Fairweather's death is another matter. I believe the key to this case lies in Miss Fairweather's true identity," continued Miss Marple. "Through the parish records, I discovered that Dorothy Lammerton was born in St. Mary Mead in 1919. Her mother was Mary Lammerton, who left the village shortly after her birth, and was later reported to have married and moved abroad." Miss Bellingham made a small sound, and Miss Marple turned to her. "You discovered who Miss Fairweather really was, didn't you, Miss Bellingham? That's why Mrs. Dean dismissed you, to protect her secret." I promised I wouldn't say," faltered Miss Bellingham. "There's no need. The truth is clear enough now." Miss Marple turned to Mrs. Dean. "Dorothy Lammerton was your daughter, wasn't she, Mrs. Dean? Or should I say, Mary Lammerton?" A profound silence fell over the room. Mrs. Dean's face had gone very white, but she maintained her composure. "How dare you make such an accusation?" she said, her voice low and dangerous. "It is no accusation, merely the truth," said Miss Marple gently. "You left St. Mary Mead in disgrace, a young unmarried mother. You later married Colonel Dean and travelled with him to India, leaving your daughter to be raised by others. When your husband died, you decided to return to the village of your birth, perhaps hoping to reconnect with your daughter." "This is preposterous," said Mrs. Dean, but her voice lacked conviction. "I don't think so," said Miss Marple. "What I cannot determine is whether you knew that Miss Fairweather was your daughter when you hired her, or whether she sought the position deliberately, hoping to find her mother." "The latter, I believe," said the Reverend Clement unexpectedly. "Miss Fairweather, Dorothy, came to me for guidance about revealing her identity to her mother. She had traced Mrs. Dean through old parish records and deliberately applied for the position of companion. She was unsure whether to make herself known, fearing rejection." "And did she reveal herself?" asked Inspector Slack. "Not initially," said Miss Marple, "but I believe she eventually did, perhaps on the day of our tea party. Something must have prompted her to do so. Perhaps it was the arrival of Mr. Craddock, whom she clearly recognized, though they both pretended not to know each other. Edwin is my nephew by marriage," said Mrs. Dean stiffly. "He has no connection to any of this." "I think he does," said Miss Marple. "I believe Mr. Craddock had met Dorothy Lammerton before, possibly in London, where she may have been living under her birth name. Their reaction to each other at tea suggested a prior acquaintance they were both anxious to conceal." "But what has all this to do with her death?" demanded Inspector Slack. "Everything," said Miss Marple simply. "Dorothy Lammerton was killed because she had recognized someone from her past, someone who feared exposure. The missing locket contained a photograph that could prove a connection. It wasn't suicide, Inspector. It was murder, carefully staged to look like suicide." "And who do you suggest was responsible?" asked the inspector skeptically. Miss Marple looked around the room, her gaze settling finally on Florence Simmons, who had just entered bearing a fresh pot of tea. "I believe the person who killed Dorothy Lammerton was the same person who replaced her sleeping medicine with a fatal dose, who staged the scene to suggest suicide, and who deliberately created a series of thefts to divert attention from the true motive." Florence set down the teapot with a steady hand, her face impassive. "That's quite an accusation, Miss Marple," said Inspector Slack. "Do you have any evidence?" "The snowdrop petals provided one crucial clue," said Miss Marple. "They were on Dorothy's slippers, suggesting she had walked in the garden the night she died. Rose also mentioned soil on the soles of the slippers. I believe Dorothy went to meet someone in the garden that night, someone she trusted." "And the open window?" asked Dr. Haydock. "Opened after her death to suggest she had taken her own life in a room filled with gas," said Miss Marple. "A common method of suicide, but not one Dorothy would have chosen, given her fear of sleeping draughts. No, she was murdered elsewhere and brought back to her room." "But why?" asked Mrs. Bantry, bewildered. "Why would anyone want to kill her?" "Because she knew something that threatened someone's position, someone who had much to lose if the truth came out." Miss Marple's gaze remained steady on Florence. "Someone who had been in Mrs. Dean's employment for 15 years, who had accompanied her from India, and who knew all her secrets." A tense silence fell over the room. Inspector Slack straightened up, his attention now focused intently on the housekeeper. "Miss Simmons, do you have anything to say?" he asked. Florence Simmons looked around the room, her gaze finally coming to rest on Mrs. Dean. Something passed between the two women, a silent acknowledgement, perhaps, or a plea. "I think," said Mrs. Dean suddenly, "that we should continue this discussion at the police station, Inspector. There are matters best not discussed in company." As the gathering broke up, Miss Marple stood by her window, watching Inspector Slack escort Mrs. Dean and Florence Simmons to his car. The truth, as she had suspected, was both simpler and more complex than it had first appeared. A pattern of human behavior she had observed before in the small dramas of village life, but magnified here into tragedy. Epilogue. Spring in St. Mary Mead. Several weeks had passed since the events at Thornwell Lodge. The snowdrops had faded, giving way to the first daffodils and crocuses that dotted Miss Marple's garden with cheerful splashes of yellow and purple. She was engaged in the gentle task of weeding around her prized hellebores when the garden gate opened to admit Mrs. Bantry. "Jane, I've been looking everywhere for you. Aren't you cold out here?" "Not at all," replied Miss Marple, straightening up carefully. "The sun is quite warm today, and I find gardening so beneficial at this time of year. One feels that life is beginning again." "Well, do come inside and have some tea. I've brought some of Cook's fruitcake." Once they were settled in Miss Marple's cosy sitting room, Mrs. Bantry could contain her curiosity no longer. "I've just come from Eastborough. The inquest on poor Miss Fairweather, or Lammerton, I should say, has finally concluded. They've brought in a verdict of murder, and Florence Simmons has been formally charged." "I expected as much," said Miss Marple, pouring tea. "The evidence was quite clear once one looked at it properly. But I still don't entirely understand it all," confessed Mrs. Bantry. "Why did Florence kill her? Was it really to protect Mrs. Dean?" "Yes and no," said Miss Marple thoughtfully. Florence had been with Mrs. Dean, or Mary Lammerton, as she was born, for many years. They met in India when Florence was a young woman seeking employment after the war. She became utterly devoted to Mrs. Dean, perhaps excessively so. "You mean she was in love with her?" "I wouldn't put it quite like that. It was more a case of complete identification with her employer's interests. When Dorothy appeared as Alice Fairweather, Florence recognized her immediately. She had been present, you see, when the child was born in St. Mary Mead all those years ago. But surely Mrs. Dean would have recognized her own daughter. Dorothy was an infant when Mrs. Dean left her. She wouldn't have known her as an adult. But Florence knew, and she feared that if Dorothy revealed herself, it would destroy the life Mrs. Dean had built. The scandal would have been considerable." Mrs. Bantry nodded. An unmarried mother who had abandoned her child, only to return to the very village where the disgrace occurred? Yes, I can see that Florence might have thought she was protecting her. Unfortunately, she went much further than protection," said Miss Marple. "When Dorothy finally revealed her identity to Mrs. Dean, on the evening after our tea visit, I believe, Mrs. Dean was initially shocked, but then began to warm to the idea of acknowledging her daughter. She even gave Dorothy the locket containing her father's photograph. But then why—" Florence overheard their conversation and was horrified. She had spent 15 years helping Mrs. Dean create a respectable identity as Colonel Dean's widow. She couldn't bear to see it all undone, so she took matters into her own hands. Mrs. Bantry shuddered slightly. "By poisoning the poor girl with sleeping draught." "Yes, she replaced Dorothy's headache medicine with a fatal dose of veronal. When Dorothy died, Florence took the locket, which contained proof of Dorothy's parentage, and later planted it among her things to suggest theft as a motive. She also arranged the scene to look like suicide." "And the pearl necklace? The silver?" "Further distractions. Mrs. Dean actually hid the pearl necklace herself to claim on the insurance. She was in some financial difficulty after her husband's death. As for the silver, Edwin Craddock took that. He was indeed in debt from gambling, just as we suspected." "But what about that botanist fellow, Fletcher, and the missing snowdrop bulbs?" "Ah, that was an entirely separate matter," said Miss Marple with a slight smile. "Mr. Fletcher was not a botanist at all, but a dealer in rare plant specimens. He had been corresponding with Mrs. Dean about her collection and took advantage of the confusion following Dorothy's death to steal some of her rarest varieties. The police have since apprehended him in Kent, attempting to sell the bulbs to a collector." Mrs. Bantry shook her head in wonder. "So many deceptions, and all happening simultaneously in our quiet little village. It's quite extraordinary." "Human nature is much the same everywhere," observed Miss Marple, reaching for her knitting. "One sees so many examples of it in a village." "And Mrs. Dean? What will happen to her?" "She has sold Thornwell Lodge and moved to London, I believe. She was not charged in connection with Dorothy's death. There was no evidence she knew of Florence's intentions, but the scandal was considerable once the truth emerged." Mrs. Bantry glanced out of the window at Miss Marple's garden, where several clumps of unfamiliar flowers were emerging. "Those are new, aren't they? I don't remember seeing those in your garden before." "Yes," said Miss Marple with a touch of pride. "They're some of Mrs. Dean's special snowdrops. She gave me the bulbs before she left, a gesture of gratitude, perhaps, for uncovering the truth about her daughter's death, painful though it was." "And what about Edwin Craddock? Will he go to prison?" "I believe he has made restitution for the silver and is working in his uncle's firm in London. He was not directly involved in the tragedy, merely a young man with poor judgment and too many debts. They sat in companionable silence for a moment, the only sound the gentle clicking of Miss Marple's knitting needles. "It's all rather sad, isn't it?" said Mrs. Bantry finally. "A daughter finding her mother only to be killed, and all because someone couldn't bear the thought of a scandal." "Yes, it is sad," agreed Miss Marple, "but it's also a reminder of how dangerous secrets can be, and how even the most respectable facades can hide darkness. I've observed it many times in St. Mary Mead. People are not always what they seem." She glanced out at her garden, where the special snowdrops would bloom next winter, a poignant reminder of a young woman who had sought her mother only to meet her death. Life would go on in St. Mary Mead, the rhythm of village existence continuing as it always had. But Miss Marple knew that human nature ensured that beneath the peaceful surface, passions and secrets would continue to simmer, occasionally erupting into tragedy. "More tea, Dolly?" she asked, reaching for the pot. "And do tell me about the new vicarage roof. I heard the parish council finally approved the funds." And so, another mystery closes its final page within the hidden library. The truth, once buried beneath years of silence and snow, has come to light at last. If this tale held you to its end, leave a like and subscribe. Your support keeps these lost stories alive. Until we meet again, keep your curiosity alive, your wits sharp, and remember, in the hidden library, every secret waits for the right reader to find it.